on the table saw, and that's gonna let us get into the next step. All right, let's get cutting. All right, here are the blanks for the boards. And I do have these turned on in so you can kind of see what the end grain is gonna look like. And with end grain, especially with walnut, it can have some pretty crazy patterns in here. And if you turn it certain ways, it can make diamonds and different kinds of shapes as you look at it. I actually did a video where I made a diamond cutting board if you want to check that out. But I don't want that here because I want the eye to go to the edges and the dovetail feature, not to the top. So I'm going to rearrange it so that it doesn't really draw the eye as much. I've got the cherry one, then the other walnut. So I am going to go ahead and glue these up, and then we can start doing some prototyping for the CNC design that we did earlier. These boards are pretty flat coming off of the drum sander. So what I'm going to do is take these over to the CNC and actually use a surfacing bit on these to get each side completely parallel with the other. And that will just go through and basically take a little bit off of each side. I can square them up on the table saw and have them ready for the dovetail jewelry. It is time to do the first actual cut on an end grain board. I gotta be honest, I am pretty nervous about it. I've done some practice with stuff and I think it's okay, but you never know. So I'm gonna do the tool path. So I'm gonna cut the male side first, actually. Then we'll cut the female side on the walnut board, and we'll see if they slide together. But I don't know, I feel pretty good about it. We'll see what happens.
Gotta be careful. Fuck, man, lay down. Caches have been pretty good all day. I don't know where that came from, but cool. I'm assuming it was a player scav that was up there just like waiting for someone to shoot. I shouldn't have shot him. He was walking by. I'm an idiot. It's all good. I had no reason to shoot that guy whatsoever. Like, I was doing fine. But that's Tarkov. One mistake could end your whole shit.
All right, the first cut is done. The CNC is buzzing in the background because I can't turn it off or I'll lose the position. But I just wanted to let you guys know, I did it for you. All this dust, I left the dust shoe off just to get those sweet time lapses, but I'm not gonna do it again. So now I'm gonna switch out to the dovetail to get that cut, and then I'm gonna switch out and go into the next board. So good so far. Other than that dust, it's driving me crazy. All right, this one turned out really nicely. The lines are nice and crisp, and the dovetail, there's no tear out there. Everything is flat, so this went really well. So now all I gotta do is clean off the CNC from all that dust, put the dust shoe on there, and then cut the complementary female dovetail on the walnut board, and then we can do the test fit. But it's looking good. I'm digging this. All right, just got done, and now I'm going to try the dry fit. I have to leave it in place because if it doesn't fit, then I have to do some more machining, but the test piece fits, so this should fit. This should fit. What? Let's measure this and see what's going on, because this does not look like it is fitting at all. This is 5 inches and 13 thousandths, and this is 4.98. So what is that? 32. How am I 32,000? Okay, so I'm 32 thousandths off apparently.
Missed it by that much.
Which is significantly more than I should be. I'm just going to keep running this until it expands. So I'll just take off a little at a time and then test it. But clearly this is a little bit too small. But it's better than the alternative. All right, since we were at the desk, you probably already know, I did take a little, just the beginning to see if it would fit, and check this out. Oh, this fits so nicely. Oh, this looks cool. So I'm super happy with how this is working, but I just had an idea and I am now gonna do something different with the project. So I wanna have some magnets to hold this in place. So I'm gonna figure that out and then we can go start working on the impossible dovetail.
Okay.
All right, I got the magnet all worked out here and it works pretty well, though it could be a little bit stronger, so I may have to go with a bigger magnet for the larger one. And speaking of the larger one, it is now time to start on the impossible dovetail joint. I've got 2 little blocks that I have glued up and made square, and it's important that these are square. You'll see why in
Need a
just
goddamn
minute.
drink.
So I definitely
Where's
want
my
to
soda?
try these out as test
There it
pieces
is.
first, because there's a lot more complexity than with just the sliding dovetail. Yes. Check this out. This is so cool. I got it assembled. The fit is almost exact. And I tell you what, it is really tight. I'll do some close-ups. You can see the grain and how tight it is. There are not any gaps. I am extremely happy with this. And here's how the impossible joint works. You can see it looks like 4 separate joints, but really it is just 2 that are cut at 45-degree angles. So you can slide them when you apply the pressure diagonally. Pretty cool trick. But I am ready to go full scale, and what I'm gonna do on the full-size board, instead of just having 1 and I was gonna make it wider, I'm gonna do 3 dovetails across. It's gonna look crazy, so it'll look more like an actual dovetailed board than what my original idea was, which just 1 wide one, which I don't think would have had the same effect. After looking at the single dovetails versus the 3, I had to go with the 3. The modeling for this one was a bit intense though. This is about a half hour of modeling cut into this short clip. But my main concern is that with 3 dovetails per side, any poor fit or error might just make this whole thing not work at all. And after I finished the modeling, I just needed to do a little more work on those blanks. While I'm prepping those boards, let's talk about the sponsor of today's video, Skillshare. Now, Skillshare is an online learning community for creative and curious people. They've got thousands of courses and things like design, productivity, photo editing, and lots of other things. Now, I've been watching Productivity Masterclass, Create a Custom System That Works by Thomas Frank. And last year, my kids were remote learning, which led to more distraction, and see if that'll help me with my task management. Skillshare has a growing community of millions of teachers
my God, with
publishing
the
new
sponsor,
classes all the boards are prepped and ready for the CNC. So what I did on the blanks is I put some little trim of it's just poplar, and I used some blue tape and CA glue to attach it there. And as soon as it goes through there, it should have support, so it shouldn't blow out. This should help protect that. So we'll see if it works or not, or if it just blows it off. But now I am ready to start the machining on the Impossible Dovetail. We'll see how it goes. The first round of machining on the base is done. I'm gonna pull it out, but it looks like it turned out really nicely. The back end did blow off the little strips, but it looks like these did a really good job at everything else stayed on, and there is no blowout, so it's gonna be super clean in the final product. So those worked out really awesome. Let's throw the walnut top in there, and we'll get to milling that, and that's where the fun comes in and trying to get the fit. This is the easy one. All right, guys, we're like right here. I am a little nervous because this, like right now, it fit, it's barely starting to fit. And I feel like I pushed it in about like an inch and it was just starting to bind up. I'm just super scared if I get it in here that I'm not gonna be able to remove it and not even be able to close it the right way. So I think I'm gonna err on the side of just getting one more pass at it. I've already done like 4 or 5 passes. One more pass to hopefully free it up enough and not have a bunch of gaps. I hope this will be the one. Let's see. If it passes this first one, then I think I'm just gonna take it all off. Oh, there we go. There we go, there we go. All right, see if this goes by. Ooh, it's still catching a little bit. Oh, it's past them and it's going. I'm gonna take all the poplar strips off, but leave it in the thing and see how it works. Should I do that? No. I'm gonna push it a little bit more. There's so much friction here. I knew this was gonna be an issue. All right, it just hit me that the rubbing is happening, like I said, because there's so much more surface area. But I'm not really concerned about the surface in the middle. All I want is the outside to look nice and crisp. So what I can do is come in here and relieve some of these edges so that there's not as much rubbing. I'm gonna try to do some sanding and, spend a few hours just really massaging the fit, if you will. All right, I just spent like an hour sanding everything, and I think this is gonna be it. Come on, go, 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 go. Yes, that is it. Oh man, that is it. I don't want to slam it all the way in there, but that is it. I'm gonna clean this bad boy up and we'll see the final look. All right, guys, check it out. Oh man, this thing turned out so amazing. And I haven't even put the finish or the oil on it, so I will do that. I'll have some beauty shots for you here in just a minute. But it fits together perfectly, and there is so much friction in here. I was worried it was going to slide apart like the sliding dovetail did. It did not, but I can look at it now, and I'll show you how it opens up. Just slides. Oh, you got to really put some pressure into it, and then it slides right open. Check that out. That is so cool. If you don't know how an impossible dovetail puzzle works, now you do. And if you've never seen a 3 dovetail puzzle, I've never seen one. Now you have. So I'm gonna sand this up and put some finish on it. I am so happy how this thing turned out. It looks amazing. Hey, if you're loving these hidden and secret feature videos, I've got a playlist queued up for you right there that's got a few more in it I think you're gonna love as well. I wanna give a big thank you to all those folks that have been joining the Builders Club. You can get more information down below, but I'll catch you guys over there on the next video. I have been waiting for this for a long time. So 5 years ago, I was stuck in an unfulfilling job. I rarely saw my family, and frankly, I just didn't feel like I was making a difference in the world. Now, fast forward to today, I own my own business, making content on YouTube, sharing things I'm passionate about. I work side by side with my wife, and we're inspiring millions to get out. What's up, guys? I'm Brad Rodriguez from Fix This, Build That, and today I'm gonna show you how to make a desk with hidden wireless charging. I'm also gonna show you a tip on how I installed this metal copper inlay into the desk. Stay tuned, I'll show you exactly how I did it. I've had this stack of walnut boards in the back of my shop for a couple years now, just waiting for the right project. And since I'm going with a simple metal base for the desk, I thought this was the perfect time to dip into the stash for a couple boards to make an amazing top. I'm going with a 20-inch desktop to try and minimize clutter that will land on it, so I cut the rough boards in half to give me 4 boards for the top. When working with rough lumber, you can get some pretty twisted boards like this, and one of the things that helps before milling is to knock down the high spots on the opposite corners of the board with a block plane. This removes some of the rocking and makes milling go a little smoother.
Come here.
And to get the rest of the twist out of the boards, I took them to the joiner and face jointed each board. It basically does what I just did with the hand plane, except a whole lot faster and more consistent. After a few passes, I got down to fresh wood, and the board now sat flat on my bench. I ran the other 3 boards through the joiner as well to get one flat face on each board before moving on to the planer. Using the flat face from the joiner, I ran each board through the planer until the mill marks were removed and I revealed fresh cut wood, which looked amazing. I finished the rough milling back at the joiner by putting a straight edge on each board, then I cut the boards a little larger than final width at the table saw. Now, if you don't have these rough milling machines, you can buy nice walnut lumber like this already surfaced from many woodworking stores locally and online. I labeled each board to keep them organized, and then I went into the first glue up. Instead of gluing all 4 boards together, I glued up 2 smaller halves. And this is going to let me flatten the pieces on my planer and do a final glue up, then I'll just have to worry about 1 seam instead of 3. After the glue was dry on the first glue up, I took the halves out of the clamps and brought them back over to the bench to fill some of the defects in the wood with epoxy. Some of the knots and cracks went all the way through the boards, so I taped them off on the backside to keep the epoxy from leaking out. Then I mixed up small portions of a 2-to-1 clear epoxy with a slow hardener and started to fill the defects. And there was a lot to fill, including a huge void on the bottom side and some nice little bug holes. These guys had a feast. After the epoxy dried, I knocked down a few high spots with my block plane. Then I ran each half through the planer until I got to fresh wood all over again. Now this is where using the 2 halves really comes in handy. It eliminates a lot of epoxy scraping because I just send that thing through the planer and let it do the work. To prep for the final glue up, I took the sections to the joiner and ran each one across to get a pair of nice straight edges. I glued the halves together, just using clamps to line everything up. I get asked this all the time, and yes, the glue joint alone is more than strong enough to hold the top together. You don't need any screws, dowels, biscuits, dominoes, or any of that. While I was waiting on the top to dry, I moved over to make the base. I'm using 1-inch tube steel for the base, and I haven't really gotten fully set up with metal cutting equipment yet, so I had my local metal yard cut it to the exact size for me, which was a huge time saver. I marked the joint connections, and I used a flap disc on my grinder to prep the metal for the welding. Like I said, I'm new and I'm still trying to figure things out, but my welding table setup is a bit rudimentary. But my welder, on the other hand, is the 210MP from Lincoln Electric, and it is smart enough to set the wire feed and the voltage for me based on just a few inputs. It takes the guesswork out of the welding, and as a beginner, I really appreciate that. You can find out more about the 210MP in a link down below in the description. I started by welding together the rectangular ends of the desk. First, I tacked them in place, then I ran a bead of weld around each side of the joint. I also quickly realized that clamping the parts down as tight as you can was key to a square joint. These little magnetic squares are more like a suggestion of keeping things square. I worked my way through the welds, and I ended up with 2 ends ready to be joined together. But before joining the ends together with the long stretchers, I ground down the weld joints with a flat disc on my grinder. Again, here when you're welding, you really want to have nice, fresh, clean metal. Since the desk is so large, I had to move it to the ground and use these magnets to hold things in place. I tacked and welded the back of the desk first, checking for square along the way. Then I flipped it over and welded the top front stretcher in place to complete the frame. I've got to say, I really enjoyed welding a full project by myself. This was only the second welding project that I've really ever done, and this is the first time I've done it solo in my own shop. I got better as I went, but I still have a ton to learn. So hit me up with your welding tips in the comments. Let me know what I'm doing wrong and how I can get better. To finish off the base, I wanted to add some tabs to screw down the top. I got some 1-inch angle iron and I laid out 6 tabs with a marker. After marking each tab, I took the angle iron to the drill press and I drilled an oversized hole for the screws. After that was done, I took the angle iron outside and I cut the tabs apart with an offcut wheel on my grinder. After cleaning the tabs up a bit with a flap disc, I turned the base upside down and I tacked each tab into place. Oh, in welding 101, don't weld your clamps to the work. Jeez. I prepped the base for paint by grinding all the weld joints smooth. And then I sprayed on a couple coats of self-etching primer. I followed up with several coats of flat black enamel and matte clear coat. Now by this time, the top was all ready to go, so I took it out of the clamps and I cut it down to final width by joining a straight edge on one side and then cutting it to final width on the table saw. To cut the top to length, I used my circular saw. I put painter's tape on the top side and then I turned the panel upside down. Now both of these things are going to help prevent tear out from the circular saw cut. I laid out my cut line with a carpenter square and then I made the cut with my track guide. I spun the top around and I made the second cut, which made the top to final length, and I had exactly what I was looking for. I'm loving the new wireless charging feature on my phone, but I don't like having the extra wires on my desk, so embedding the charger on the top is a great alternative. I trade.
Backpack. Oh, those tips are good. There's always good stuff in here. I'm getting M4 out of here. Actually, I don't need those. What is that? Goliath. I hear walking is from the way. That's garbage. Go with that. Right at the mall entrance. That sucks. Well, building. Backpack though. The only thing I can hope is maybe there's a scav over here. I don't think it's gonna happen. Take this, but I kind of can't. Wait, it's like, maybe I can. Oh, I can't. Shit. Goodbye, shotgun. If I make it out of this raid, I'll be shocked because I'm not paying attention. I don't know why. I don't know. Compact is driving me freaking crazy. That scav player should have shot me. You should have known right off the bat I was holding 2 guns and I wasn't a scav, regular scav. Okay, it seems like all the castles have been hit, so I'm gonna have to check it out.
The shape of the charger, and then I used a router to remove the waste freehand. And since I don't have a plunge router, I drilled a starter hole with a Forstner bit, and then I started the router in the middle and slowly circled outward until I hit that layout line that I had traced. After confirming the fit, I took another pass, taking about 3/8 of an inch off at a time. I also routed a little recess pointed towards the back so I could fit the USB plug for the charger. For the final pass, I used an 1/8 of an inch piece of scrap to position the bit. I tested the charger through this material and it's still charged, so I figured I would be good to go with this depth. After I was done, I couldn't wait to test it out, so I put the charger into the slot, flipped over the top, and held it in place with one hand. And then the moment of truth.
Yeah!
I was pretty stoked it actually worked, even with this case that's on my phone. I'll link the charger that I used down below if you want to use the same one. To give the USB cable a sleek way to come out of the back of the desk, I cut a trench for the cable. I used my smaller palm router and a 1/4 inch bit and just made one shallow pass straight back to the edge of the top. The test fit looked great and I flipped the top over and I sized up where the phone would sit while it was charging. And hey, if this is your first time visiting my channel, welcome! If you like what you see, be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to get notifications when I upload new videos. Thanks a lot and hope to see you around. I wanted an easy indicator to know where to put the phone, and Nick Kyle from Blackbird Machinist sent me this awesome copper bow tie a while back. So I figured it would make a perfect accent and give a reference for the charger at the same time. I positioned the bow tie where I wanted it, and then jumped into the inlay. Now, I've never done any inlays like this, and I was pretty scared to do it, honestly. I didn't want to ruin the top because I just worked so hard on it. But I made a couple test runs in scrap wood, and then I just dove in. I used some double stick tape to hold down the bow tie, and then I scored an outline with a razor blade. Then I set my palm router to the thickness of the inlay and routed out the majority of the waste, staying pretty far away from the lines. Then comes the time-consuming part of cutting to the line. I really took my time here because I knew with metal that I wouldn't be able to fill the gaps as easily as if it were a wooden inlay and only had one shot at it. And the rest of the work is done with chisels. I just switched back and forth between my 1-inch chisel, which I use to make long straight cuts, and the smaller chisels, which remove material a little easier since there was less cutting surface. Just take your time here again and finesse it until you get the right fit. When I was done, I mixed up some epoxy to hold the inlay in place, and I spread it on the bottom of the recess. I used a scrap block of wood on the inlay and tapped it into place. I actually think I put a little too much epoxy in, and it caused the inlay to be just a little proud of the surface. So to flush everything up, I started with 60 grit sandpaper and sanded the copper until it was flush. Then I worked my way up through the grits. This took a long time, so I would err on doing it too deep with a metal inlay versus too shallow in the future. And now is the part that I've been waiting for ever since I milled this walnut. For the finish, I'm using fast-drying polyurethane from Minwax, the sponsor of today's video, and it's an oil-based, durable, protective finish that really makes this walnut look amazing. And since the desk surface is going to get a ton of wear, this tough polyurethane finish is perfect for the job. I applied one thick coat with a foam brush, and then I came back later with a thin-down second coat to get that nice, smooth finish. You can find out more about the fast-drying polyurethane via the link down below in the description. When the finish was dried, it was time to install the charger. I opted for a quick and easy mounting by just hot gluing it in. And don't be a goon here and hot glue all over the wire, it just makes a mess. Put the glue in the channel and then press the wire into it. You live and you learn. I finished off the assembly by flipping the base onto the top and mounting it with 3/4 inch screws. Then I tapped in some plastic feet into the vertical steel tubes and I was done. This desk came out way better than I ever imagined it would. I got to try out a lot of new techniques with this one that stretched my skills as a woodworker and a metalworker. And on top of it all, I got a desk that has a ton of character and wireless charging that's out of sight and always on the ready.
Hey, if you love this video, I think you're going to love that one too. Go check it out. I got another one queued up there for you. If you're not subscribed to the channel already, I'd love to have you as part of the team. And until next time, guys, get out there and build something awesome. I'm Brad, and today we're building a modern desk with hidden wire management.
And with working from home combined with our 3 kids doing homeschool now, desk space is at a premium. And frankly, I don't want another IKEA piece of junk like what we've had for the kids. I'm using walnut for this desk, so it's going to look nice out in our family room. And to keep it tidy, I'm including some wire management into the design, which I'll show you later. Now this video has a ton of tips and tricks, and as always, mistakes were made. So I started off the base for the desk, which is made of solid walnut. I bought more boards than I needed, and I did some initial milling before picking the best ones to use for the desk. I finished milling the parts down to 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches. You could also use off-the-shelf 2x2s here if you don't have access to these milling machines or the hardwood.
All right, we got all the pieces for the base here, and I did get some burning though. When I was cutting on the table saw, there was some burning here on the side. So I'm gonna go ahead and sand that off now before I start cutting and before assembly. It's gonna be way easier to do it now
versus later when it's totally put together.
And batching your parts together and sanding them in groups of 2 or 3 makes this quick, and it's really going to save you a lot of time prepping for finish later. Now the base is an A-frame style with legs angling out from the top. I set the miter saw for the angle that I needed, and I cut the ends off of the legs. Now don't throw away these offcuts here because we're going to be using them later. From there, I marked one leg for the length that I wanted, and I brought it back over to the miter saw, and then I lined up the cut, and I set my stop block in place so that I could get repeatable cuts from there. And I used those offcuts to make the upper and lower rails of the side assembly and cut everything to size. And then it was time for some joinery. I laid out one of the sides on the bench to do a little mock-up and mark for the dowel joinery that I'm using to connect the parts. With the parts flush on top, I made pencil marks across the joint for where I wanted the dowels. And make sure to give enough space between the lines so the dowel holes won't run into each other. I've learned that one a few times. And now I can use those marks to drill the dowel holes on each piece, and they're going to line up right together. I used my poor man's vise, which is 2 parallel clamps clamped together, to hold the rail and drill the holes in the end. And drilling the leg is much easier as you can do it on the bench, and it doesn't try to move on you like it does when you're drilling those ends. Now there's several ways to drill dowel holes, but I like this self-centering dowel jig. And I'll have a link to it and all the other tools that I used in this build down in the description. The top rail went together nicely. Now I could clamp it in place and mark for the lower rail.
And whenever you're clamping up something that is slanted like that, it's always a great idea to save your offcuts because these are the perfect angle to put on the sides to make sure that you can clamp it without the clamps slipping off. So I cut some little pieces of sandpaper and I'm going to spray adhesive them to these little clamps, and it's going to let me clamp these without the clamps moving off it.
I clamped the top together using the blocks, and then I slid that lower rail up until it fit snug. After measuring to make sure it was parallel to the bottom, I marked for the dowels just like before. And then I could drill the holes in that lower rail and the legs and finish off the joinery for the side assembly. And when you're assembling everything, you'll need to do it one side at a time versus the top and the bottom. And you'd quickly find out why if you try it. Now putting glue on the dowels is pretty much all you're going to need to do here. If you fill the holes with glue, you're going to have squeeze out everywhere and just make a mess. Getting dried glue off the inside corners is really a pain, so I aim for just the point where I get barely a little bit of squeeze out to come out. I've repeated the process for the other side and I let them dry overnight. And then I came back and I sanded all the joints flush and I removed any dry glue so it wouldn't affect the finish later. The sides are joined by 2 top stretchers and a lower stretcher in the back. I cut the pieces to length for all 3 of these parts and I took them to the bench for assembly. Now my thought process here was to lay out the lower stretcher with dowels and then attach the top ones with pocket holes later. But you'll see why that went wrong. I drilled the holes in the ends of the stretcher, but since that lower rail is in the way on the side, I couldn't use the jig to drill the side assembly. Now instead, I got these little dowel points, and I put them in the holes that I drilled, and I used them to mark where I needed those mating holes to be on that leg assembly. And then I could take those leg assemblies over to the drill press, and then drill out 3/8 of an inch holes on the marks that the points had left. You could also drill these by hand, but my hand drilling is highly suspect, and I actually want this thing to fit together right. So I went ahead and I assembled the sides together using just that lower stretcher here. Now the legs wanted to lean in a bit, so I used the top stretchers as a spacer to hold the sides parallel to each other. After it was dry, I went to install the top stretchers and found the issue.
I messed up. What I should have done is put these 2 in when I did this top one, and I consciously didn't do that because I was just going to attach it with pocket screws. But what I found was that the pocket screws I have are just too long for my liking, and the other screws I have are not long enough. So I'm going to use some 3/8 wooden dowel, and I'm going to drill all the way through from the A-frames into those cross members, put the dowels in, glue them in place, and then plug it with a walnut cap. And I think that's going to look pretty nice, and we'll call it a design feature.
I laid out marks for 2 pieces of dowel rod at each joint. I figured the easiest way to drill the holes out was just to clamp everything in place and drill straight through both pieces at the same time. I flipped the base upside down so I could get the stretchers flush with the top of the sides, and I drilled through until I went into those top stretchers. I also found 2-inch dowels so that I didn't have to cut down a rod, and I used one to figure out how deep I needed to drill. Now before I put the dowels in, I cut some custom walnut plugs using a plug cutter in my drill press.
Having plugs cut from the same material is going to really help it blend in well. And really, I just like snapping these things off with a screwdriver. Now I put some glue on the dowels and I hammered them into place. And I used a punch with a piece of tape marked on it to put them exactly halfway between the sides and the stretchers. And then I came back and I installed the plugs and put them in as far as they would go. And the fit was really tight, so I crushed the ends a little bit with some pliers to help them get started. I finished off by cutting the plugs with a flush trim saw. Using a little tape next to the plugs would have helped me not mar up the surface, but those saw marks sanded out just fine. And matching the grain direction on the plugs makes them almost disappear. What a great design feature. Now next I'm making the top from 3/4 inch walnut plywood. Now I want to give a big thank you to Woodcraft and Jet, the sponsors of today's video. Now Woodcraft makes this Wood River panel cart, which is awesome for saving your back and moving full sheets of plywood around the shop. They also sell a full line of Jet products, including the milling machines that I used on the walnut, as well as my Cyclone dust collector that helps keep my shop clean. Check the links in the description to the Woodcraft website to learn more and to support two great woodworking brands. Now, after ripping the top and bottom pieces to width, I started making the miters for the box. I'm using the table saw and my old sled to make these angled cuts, but you could also use a track saw or the router table as well. I left the piece for the top long so that I could cut it exactly to size, and I'll have enough material on the offcuts to make the left and right sides. And this is going to give me a continuous or waterfall grain around the sides, which is going to look really awesome. Oh, and if you're wondering why I'm using dumbbells on the top of the plywood, it's just to make sure that they're laying flat on the sled for that whole cut, and because I don't use them for much anything else these days.
Back in '82, I used to be able to throw a pigskin a quarter mile.
Now I'm going to be reinforcing the miters with a spline of 1/4 inch plywood. I recorded a lot more video about this entire process and how to get great fitting miter joints and even tips on how to fix bad ones. I actually had so much footage, I'm going to be doing a whole nother video on this. So if you want to see this whole process in detail, I'll have that video linked at the end when it goes live. The top has 2 drawers separated by a center divider, and I'm using dados cut in the top and bottom to hold that divider into place. Now, after a few test cuts to dial in the right size dado for the plywood, I ran the top and bottom through the sled. I also made sure that I used the left side of each part against the fence so that it would be lined up correctly. And next I cut that center divider from the offcut of the bottom piece, and I trimmed it shorter than the depth of the desk. Leaving it short here is the first part of that chase for the wire management. Then I cut a long piece the length of the inside of the desk, and that's going to go behind the divider to close off the drawer section and make that hidden area. I did a dry fit to make sure everything lined up properly, and then I added some pocket holes to that long divider so I can easily attach it during assembly. Now, the glue up doesn't seem that complicated, but it was one of the most hectic ones I've done. First off, I forgot to switch to a slow setting glue, which I would recommend, and secondly, clamping up miters is never easy. I started from the bottom and I put that center divider in place, and then I screwed down the long one, making sure that they were flush with the front and the sides accordingly. Now, the miter splines actually do make this a bit easier as they hold the sides in place without the need for clamps. But a good web clamp is worth its weight in gold here as you're assembling it, and I was putting that top on and just struggling through it. But a ratchet strap works in a bind here as well. I'll give you some good tips on gluing up miters also in that upcoming video. But for all the struggle, the top turned out great and those miters really look nice coming off the glue up. Now to cover the plywood edges on the front, I milled up some small walnut strips. I made the edge banding just slightly larger than the thickness of the plywood, and I made them 1/8 of an inch thick. I mitered the trim and I went around the frame attaching it with glue and 23 gauge pin nails. The pin nails leave very small holes that can be filled later with sawdust and glue. But you could also just clamp the trim in place with some painter's tape and then remove it after it was dried. I cut a small piece to fit that center divider, and then I came back an hour later and sanded all the trim flush with the box on the inside and the outside of the drawer openings. Next I measured and cut the drawer parts for the desk. I'm using full extension soft close slides, and I adjusted my measurements to fit the hardware as needed. Now pocket holes in the fronts and the backs are making these drawers go together easily, but if you're a regular viewer, you'll notice something a little bit different about these drawers. I'm using 1/2 inch Baltic birch plywood instead of 3/4 inch, which I typically use. And that's mainly just because I had some extra laying around, but also I thought a lighter looking drawer would go well with this design. Now, though they do look better, my standard drawer assembly approach doesn't work quite as well with 1/2-inch ply when attaching the bottoms with brad nails or staples. I had problems with both of them blowing out and also spacing the nails far enough from the edge so that I could chamfer the bottom and not hit one. So if you go with 1/2-inch ply, I'd recommend a floating bottom panel instead. Now to finish off the drawers, I wanted to make some unique drawer fronts with my CNC. I want these drawer fronts to be sleek, but also be kind of cool. So I'm gonna go to the X-Carve and I'm going to CNC in some geometric shapes in here. Then I'm gonna backfill it with some black epoxy. It should be a really cool look, so let's get it set up. I attached the drawer fronts to the base of the X-Carve using tape and CA glue so that I could carve the entire surface of the front. Now the design I'm using actually came from a wallpaper that I saw online. I took a picture of it and I traced it in Illustrator, and then I imported it into Easel, which is Inventable's design and cutting software for the X-Carve. And I used a 60-degree V-bit to cut out the design about 1/8 of an inch deep. And I did leave the fronts oversized so that I could come back and cut them to an exact fit in the next step. Adding little embellishments like this into a project is a great use for the CNC, and I want to keep exploring how I can use the X-Carve more in my shop. After cutting both pieces, I gave them a quick sanding and I wrapped the edges in tape for the next step. To really set off the design, I wanted to fill the carvings with some colored epoxy. So I mixed up some Total Boat High Performance with a fast setting hardener, and I added in some black pigment to the mix. I wasn't sure how much the epoxy would cover, but after fumbling around a bit on the first one, I mixed up another batch and I found it was easiest to apply it almost like you put grout on a tile floor. I also backfilled the lines with a syringe to make sure that epoxy was above the wood where it was needed. That was actually really fun to do. Now the next day I sanded away all the epoxy on the surface until I got back down to raw wood, and it looked awesome. Now this is exactly what I was hoping for. I cut the fronts to final size, and it gave me clean epoxy edges on the outside, and it also let me line up the designs of the drawer fronts. This way I could have a seamless transition between them. And since I wasn't sure if I'd get enough comments about all the machines that I used on this build,
Good one.
I decided to go ahead and use my router table to route finger pulls on the underside of the fronts. I actually wanted to make the finger pulls hidden and stop 1 inch before the ends, but apparently I can't read the tape measure on my router fence, so I pivoted and ran them all the way across. Design feature. Now the last piece of the puzzle was to trick out the wire management for the top. I started by routing a rabbet in the back to hold a 1/4 inch plywood panel. Clamping an off-cut of the plywood to the box really helps make balancing the router easier on this thin edge. Now the whole purpose of the chase is to get a lot of wires into it and send fewer wires out. So I drilled holes on the bottom and the back corners, and I positioned them so they were in line with the legs. Though I'd probably move them in a little bit further if I did build this again. And if you want plans for this desk, I will have those available, and they're going to include all the changes that I'd make. I finished off those holes by rounding over the edges to prevent the plywood veneer from chipping over time. Now to enclose the chase, I cut down a piece of 1/4 inch plywood using referential measurements, aka putting it in place and marking it. Referential measurements just sounds way more fun. I could have squared the corners of the rabbet on the back to fit the piece, but instead I decided to round the corners of the back panel. I just used a fender washer to mark the curve, and then I sanded to the line on my oscillating belt sander. I thought about putting a slot in the top of the desk or a removable panel for the wires to go in, but I just couldn't bring myself to break up that beautiful top with a slot. So instead, I laid out and cut an entry point at the top center of that back panel. Now I'll route the wires over the back and into the chase, and I'll use some cable clips on the back of my monitor to make them nice and tidy. And I also drilled some finger holes in that back panel to make it easily removable and pair up with my attachment method. I've got the back piece all cut out, and I'm going to attach it to the back, but I'm going to attach it with magnets instead of nailing it or screwing it. And the reason is wires are going to roll over the back through this little section. A little power strip can live back there, and USB hub and whatever else. So I'm going to drill little holes and epoxy some magnets in here, and then on the other side I'm going to drive in a few screws, and that's going to allow the magnets to catch on those. I drilled the holes until the magnets were just flush with the surface. And yes, I was playing with fire by using the top of the desk for a workbench with only a scrap piece between it. I think I was just tired of moving that thing around. But I mixed up some 5-minute epoxy, and I scuffed up the magnets with sandpaper and installed them into those holes. Now while that was curing, I drilled pilot holes